Hey folks, and welcome to Typology, the show in which we explore the mystery of the human personality through the lens of the Enneagram. I'm Anthony Skinner, producer of the show. We truly hope that you are staying safe and healthy in this challenging season that we find ourselves in, and we're super happy that you have joined us today. We've got a great show for you. Hey, I wanted to give you a heads up. Ian has been going live on Instagram, and it's been really fun. He went live this past Monday before this podcast and the Monday prior. Now, he might mix it up and not always be going live on Mondays, but be watching for him. If he pops up in your feed, be sure and jump on. I think the last couple have been around 7 o'clock. Of course, he's talking about the Enneagram, and there's a few friends that have jumped on from time to time. I think Johnny Swim jumped on. Drew and Ellie Holcomb jumped on. This week, the amazing artist and writer Mako Fujimura was on with Ian, hopped on there. Spoken word artist Propaganda jumped on. I jumped on and sang a song. People asked their Enneagram questions and Ian responds. So it's been a real community experience, a lot of fun. So be sure to jump on for that if you see him pop up in your feed. Hey, this week we've got a great guest, and what he does and what his number is an interesting combo. Our guest is Russell Moore. He is an ethicist, a theologian, an award-winning writer, and head of the Moral and Public Policy Agency of the SBC. He is a regular commentator on a wide range of issues. Wall Street Journal has called Moore vigorous, cheerful, and fiercely articulate. He was named in 2017 to Politico's magazine list of top 50 influence makers in Washington and has been profiled by such publications as The Washington Post and The New Yorker. He is the author of several books. You're going to enjoy this interview, and we'll wait for the reveal on the number. That's it for me, Anthony Skinner, and without any further ado, here is the host of our show, Ian Cron.
Russell Moore, welcome to Typology.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Well, it's a delight. I've been looking forward to this conversation. It might be fun to begin with you telling our folks how you and I first connected.
We have a mutual friend, Andrew Peterson, who's a musician, and I think we met the first time over at his place, and then since then get together regularly over there for all sorts of things, including what I enjoy a lot, reading through T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets together with a group of guys. I really that's one of the things I look forward to most in any given month.
Man, I'll tell you, that has been a delight. I also want to say that, let me tell you about the first time I'd heard of you. I'd known you by reputation as a writer, as a journalist, in your work for the Southern Baptist Convention. You know, I also know you from a great Twitter war with Donald Trump, the now epic Twitter war between Russell Moore and Donald Trump. But I can recall back, I think it was May 18th, on your podcast, which is called
Signposts.
You wrote or did an episode on May 18th called What About the Enneagram?
Mm-hmm.
And someone said to me, hey, have you heard Russell Moore did a whole episode devoted to the Enneagram? And I was like, no, he didn't. That's like David Brooks doing a show on the Enneagram. I mean, come on. And he's like, no, I'm being completely serious. And so I want to ask you, what was the inspiration to actually, because it's not in your wheelhouse necessarily. So what inspires you to do a podcast episode on the Enneagram?
Well, the first time I ever heard about the Enneagram was years and years ago when I was in education, in theological education, and someone had complained about one of the professors who worked for me assigning a book on the Enneagram, and they said he's assigning this occultic thing, and they showed me the image of it, and of course, if you just look at it, it does look almost like a pentagram.
Yeah.
And so that was the last time that I had thought about it for years and years, until I started really benefiting from Enneagram and using it as a tool to be able to understand, especially a lot of the differences between the way that I would process something and the way that people that I work with or people in my family really helped me with our kids, figuring out why my kids are so different from each other, and in some cases from me. And so it was a helpful tool for me.
Well, I was so grateful when you did it. You know, it's interesting. When the book came out, I anticipated getting a lot of blowback compared to other books I'd written. I expected that there would be some in the faith community that would, offer quite a bit of resistance. And ironically, I received less criticism for The Road Back to You than I have for my other two books combined. I mean, it's actually remarkable to me. So one question I have for you, because you are someone who has your finger on the pulse of culture and faith, why is it, do you think, that the Enneagram has become such a hot topic and resource, even among people who 15 years ago wouldn't have touched it with a stick?
I think it's almost become common enough that people are not scared to talk about it. It doesn't seem like some esoteric sort of thing. And it's helpful just in giving shorthand when you're talking about various people. And I really haven't found what I worried about at first when Enneagram started to become more popular, especially in my circles. American evangelicalism can be really faddish and can take any good thing in completely blown out of proportion ways. And so what I was afraid is that you would have the thing that every Enneagram test cautions against, which is, oh, that's a typical 8 for you. You know, that sort of thing taking place. I really haven't found that very much. Instead, what I found is a lot of people using it exactly the way I think most people would hope, which is to try to understand other people better. Yeah. I mean, I even had someone say to me not long ago about someone that we both knew, I thought that he was just a silly and non-serious person, and now I just get he's a 7. And so they're understanding each other better, and I find that encouraging.
Yeah. Well, I find it encouraging too that people are in faith communities, perhaps of all kinds, or people of any type of faith background, are developing an interest in self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And self-awareness. And so I'm delighted for that. I can't begin to tell you what a good feeling it is to get up in the morning and realize that part of what you're doing is helping people unpack the mystery of how God's image makes itself known in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and that's an incredible delight for me. Okay, now I want to jump into your, we mentioned it at the opening of the show, but I have to be honest and tell you that when I listened to your podcast, or maybe prior to that, maybe Andrew had mentioned something about your familiarity with the Enneagram. And then I read up on you, and it says here that you're the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the moral and public policy agency of the nation's largest Protestant denomination. You are an ethicist, a theologian, award-winning writer, and head of the moral and public policy agency of the SBC. Now, if someone had said to me, all right, you got to guess what this guy's type is based on his job title, right? And his education, his CV, all that stuff. We have not done the big reveal yet on your type here, but I would have said, oh, if I had to put $50 on it with humility, I'd say there's no question he's a 1.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Right, Anthony?
Yeah, I'm surprised that you are the number you are, which we're waiting to reveal.
Yes. We have a dear friend who's been on the show twice. You know him. It's a mutual friend, Lee Camp, who is an ethicist and a theologian and a hardcore 1.
Yeah, I could see that.
Hardcore 1. Ones would be very naturally drawn, as you can imagine, it's a no-brainer, to the world of ethics.
Right.
They're concerned about what does it mean to be good? They're concerned about virtue. They're concerned about trying to understand what is appropriate and right behavior, thinking, feeling about particular issues of ways of being in the world. Secondly, ones are very drawn to issues of policy. This is why, by the way, I'm going to out myself a little bit here on some politics, but I think no question Jimmy Carter was a one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Elizabeth Warren is a one. I think Hillary Clinton is a one. The problem with one presidents can be, I'm not saying ones can't be president, is they tend to get down into the weeds of policy.
Yeah.
And then they can't get out of them, right? So they don't operate at, they tend to start to operate at 10,000 feet instead of 100,000 feet, and they get lost in the weeds. So all this led me to believe Russell Moore is a one. Policy, ethics, all, theologian. He's a one, he's got to be. And then I met you and you told me you were?
A four.
I mean, seriously, my hair caught fire. You told me that you were a four. I was like, you're a what? You might as well have just told me you were a Martian. I was like, that is not that, one of these things doesn't go with the other. I mean, it was like, Russell, how is it? I'm just curious. Don't you ever get up in the morning and wonder if you're a one?
No, but I probably, when I just read the list of what each one was without actually reading anything else, I probably would have thought that too. But then the first time that I ever, and I don't even remember which book it was, whether it was yours or another, on each Enneagram type, I immediately knew by the time I got to the fourth chapter or wherever it was, oh yeah, that's me. And I think most people who have been around me very long knew that immediately. My wife certainly did, and a lot of people who worked with me, because I'm not an in the weeds policy person. That's not the way that when I was a teacher, that's not the way I taught, and that's not the way that I lead right now. So I'm more concerned. Policy is a little piece of what we do. Most of it is sort of moral formation of people in terms of families and personal lives and churches and whatever. But even the policy piece is the policy issues are more ways of introducing the gospel story into particular situations and into particular lives. And so I think my team is probably tired of my saying this. I would much rather lose in a way that has long-term sort of transformative benefits than I would to win in a way that would diminish who someone is as a person, or diminish the authenticity of the gospel, or those sorts of things.
Well,
but I'm reliant on ones. I need a lot of ones around me who really, really like to who like to go deep into the weeds, ones and fives, on all sorts of stuff, and who also I'm the sort of person who is always, or not always, but both and as much as possible. I can see the benefits of multiple things, and I want to synthesize them wherever that's good and possible. And I need a lot of those either or people in order to rightly see what the various options and possibilities are in front of me. I really need that.
Oh, all right. We've had enough wisdom for one show. We can cut this baby off. I mean, so here you are. If you had told me early on, if I got to know you post early on, that you were a both and thinker, then I'd go, he's probably not a one, because ones tend to be dualistic thinkers. They are either or types, black and white thinkers. And to hear a four who's a both and thinker say, I need either or people around me, I just think that's modeling how the Enneagram can be helpful in management situations and in relationships with partners or, children. It's like Corinthians. You can't tell the hand that, it doesn't need the eye, or whatever the exact, sorry, you probably know the exact quote. I don't. But we get the idea, right? Like we need each other to be at our very best.
But hear me, I'm not saying that I like it. Always.
Right.
So I have to kind of check myself at getting annoyed at. I have a lot of 1s, a lot of 8s, a lot of 3s around me, and I sometimes get annoyed and have to sort of remind myself of what's going on here. But so it's not it's not something I always naturally do or like.
Well, and I'm sure this is, I hope this doesn't sound harsh, but I'm sure particularly your 8s and your 1s get annoyed with you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say 8s interpret both and thinking as weakness, right? Indecisiveness, which to them is a sign of, not being solid, not being strong.
Yes.
Right? And 1s don't like it because for them, things are either right or wrong. And there's no such thing as nuance. Or there is. I mean, we're overstating it here. But nuance does not come naturally to a 1.
Right. And the other thing is a lot of the 8s that I have around me that I need, I really do, sometimes have the idea that because the benefit that I bring is content, imagination, ideas, vision, all of that sort of thing, they sometimes have the idea that just happens. And so I have to sort of constantly work against people who want to put me at ribbon cuttings all day, every day, and still expect me to be able to do the stuff that I do. And I can't do that, and sometimes have to explain that and re-explain it.
You talked about content. I just read for the second time this morning, you just had an op-ed in the New York Times, about 2 weeks ago, was it?
Yes, I think so.
You had an op-ed in the New York Times titled, God Doesn't Want Us to Sacrifice the Old. Christianity teaches that every single life is valuable during a pandemic. And boy, what a great op-ed.
Thank you.
Yeah. And written with that 4-ish empathy, broad view. I didn't feel like it was finger waggy at all. It was just beautifully composed. And anyway, I just want to throw that in to commend the people to read that article. Because it was a really wonderful perspective during a time in our current crisis when some people have been saying, why don't we just let the old go, so that we can get back to work, which is kind of either or thinking, it's like, let's just do this in favor of that. And I thought it was a wonderful counter to that. All right. So I have a question for you. 4s tend to wrestle with existential questions. Big, and they, if we look at the bottom of the Enneagram diagram, the gap between all the other numbers is the same, right? Size-wise. The gap between 4 and 5 is larger, it's wider than it is between all the other types. And one of the reasons on the Enneagram, we talk about the abyss, which is that big gap that sits between 4 and 5, because 4s and 5s can go into this sort of angst-ridden, existential, they're always sort of peeking over into the abyss. You'll meet 5s who have read a lot of Nietzsche. They've read a lot of Camus, and they're looking over the edge. And that's why some 5s and 4s can get this kind of depressive, melancholy, like they have looked into the darkness below, in that big gap, right? Is that your experience? And is there an existential question, particularly at this moment in our world, that you're wrestling with, that constantly is coming up for you? And maybe it's a boyhood one. Maybe it's followed you through life. What would that existential question be for you as a 4?
Well, two things. I mean, one of them is my wife will sometimes, I heard her explain to somebody one time, she said, if you want to understand my husband, then you have to listen to the music that he listens to. She said, and this is the key. She said, probably the most listened to artist in his entire musical library is Jimmy Buffett. But it's not the fun Caribbean Margaritaville Jimmy Buffett songs. It's the death of an unpopular poet. He went to Paris. The sort of melancholy, morose Jimmy Buffett song, and that's true. And it took her a while. She's a 2. It took her a while to get that I actually like when we go back to a place we used to live, and I will go to the door of the place we used to live and just soak in the nostalgia and the bittersweet pain that comes. She really can't much get that. Or one thing that drives her absolutely crazy, because I do it all the time, as recently as 30 minutes before we started this interview, is I will say things like, do you realize that so-and-so, speaking about somebody from our past, was such and such age at that time? And do you realize it has been 15 years since that happened? And 15 years from now, our kids will be this old and we'll be this old. And, you know, but she why do you want to do that? And so that's always there. For me, the sort of existential anguish is a key part of the biography for me, because when I was around 15, I was thrown into this tailspin that led to a deep depression that was suicidal. Nobody knew it at the time, but I was suicidal at the time, and it was over the question of authenticity, and particularly in my situation, the authenticity of Jesus, of the gospel. I grew up in church and belonged in the church, loved the church, loved everything about it. But I was in this Bible Belt context where I was seeing a lot of racism and a lot of violence. And that not just seeing those things, but seeing those things coming particularly from a Christian, under a Christian name. And so I came to the point where I was starting to wonder, is all of this really just a prop for some sort of culture or some sort of political agenda? Or something like that. That was around the time that not only was I seeing all of that kind of locally, the domestic violence, the racism happening, not in my church, but in the Bible Belt generally. Seeing that happen, you had the TV evangelist scandals taking place at the same time at the national level. And you had, and so my question was, if this is all just that, it's a means to an end, then that means that Jesus isn't alive. And if Jesus isn't really there, then everything that I think that I've experienced is false, which means the universe is a really dark, socially Darwinian sort of place. And so thankfully, I had read through all of the Chronicles of Narnia as a little kid. So I recognized C.S. Lewis's name on the spine of Mere Christianity and took it home. And that really it didn't only save my faith, it probably saved my life, and not because of the arguments. So it's not the 1 or the 5 sort of going through the arguments and having those intellectual questions resolved. It was that there was something about the way he was writing that I could tell he wasn't trying to sell me anything. And that there was something authentic there. And so that that was a real pivot point and really explains everything else. I mean, everything else that I have done since then is coming from that moment to that 15-year-old. So that's why I'm driven crazy by cultural Christianity, means to an end, sort of using Jesus for something else, civil religion, whatever, drives me crazy. And why I'm always speaking to that 15-year-old kid, because I know there are others in that situation like that out there, and that's in whatever we're doing. That's who I'm talking to.
Powerful answer. And what you were describing there of that existential crisis, if you will, is to me a perfect example of a 4 looking over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Like if there is no, if there is no explanation for why there is something out of nothing,
yeah.
if Jesus is not who he said he is, that's a 4 asking questions that a lot of other people, going to spaces, a lot of people will just say, don't want to go there, don't want to go there.
Yeah.
4s and 5s will go, no, let's go peek over and see how dark it could get. And oftentimes it doesn't end well for 4s and 5s. So that was a beautiful description of that feature of a 4's life. But my next question, even though this is a little bit off topic, how are you possibly surviving in a current climate with those convictions, where you have an aversion to the idea of somebody co-opting or hijacking Jesus for perhaps political purposes?
Hey everybody, one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that not everybody benefits from a traditional 50-minute counseling session. And this is why some people can go to couples therapy or personal counseling for a long time and never really get anywhere. This is why I'm such a believer of intensive counseling and my friends at Restoring the Soul in Colorado, created by my longtime friend Michael Cusick to help couples or individuals experience deep change in half-day blocks over 1 or 2 weeks. Now listen, if you can't wait months or years to get to the bottom of an issue or to experience breakthrough, you need to get in touch with my friend Michael and his extraordinary team of counselors at Restoring the Soul. If you're looking to get out of the rut you're in, but can't wait months or years, call Restoring the Soul today for a free consultation with Michael's staff. Call 303-932-9777 and learn how their intensive counseling process can help you. As a special bonus, just for Typology listeners, make sure to visit www.restoringthesoul.com/typology to download their PDF called 5 Ways Unaddressed Trauma May Be Derailing Your Relationship.
How are you surviving in where that's happening everywhere? The sort of commingling of nationalism, populism, and American religion, particularly evangelicalism.
Yeah. I think because there are a lot of people out there who don't want means to an end Christianity. There are a lot of people who do, but there are a lot of people who don't. And that's especially the case when you're looking at younger evangelical Christians, who I often find myself, because I'm dealing with journalists every day, and a lot of them for a lot of them, I'm the only Christian they've ever met, or church-going Christian that they've ever met in their lives or spent any time with. And one of the things I have to say is, you think that younger Christians are what you define as liberal. And in my context anyway, they're usually not. They're usually more orthodox, if you're defining it theologically, than their parents or grandparents would have been, just because they've had to work through all this stuff and think through all this stuff. But they're not wanting anything that seems to be marketing. They really do want to be in connection with mere Christianity and with the actual apostolic gospel. So I think there's a lot of people like that out there. And a lot of times they're not really paid as much attention to because they're not the people who are
tabloid worthy.
Well, yeah, tabloid worthy, or because by definition, if you're using Christianity as a means to an end, and the end is what interests you, and the end happens to interest other people who are watching, then that's going to make it. You know, the other thing I often say to journalists is you assume that evangelicalism, my tradition, is something that's like cicadas going into hibernation between Iowa caucuses, so that what's really important is what is the political angle here,
Right.
where the people who by definition they're not talking to. I could take you even in Iowa, church after church after church that have the most vital and growing ministries. I can think of a church network that has thousands of college kids there. Well, they're not going to be having a voter registration drive on Sunday. They're not going to have candidates show up on Sunday morning. So if that's what somebody's interested in, they're just not going to look at those people. Nor are they going to hold a press conference to say, we think that what the church down the street is doing is bad. They just do what they think that they're called to do. And
Right.
and that's how it works out. So I think there are a lot of people like that in the country right now.
Yeah. So in this moment, I've been wondering this question. Well, actually, let me circle back. So when I asked you about the existential angst, what that's as a young man you described, and there was a resolution to it. What about today? Is there an existential four-ish kind of question that you find haunts you at the present moment?
I find that one of the things that's difficult for me is being able to deal with inauthenticity and hypocrisy in people that I have respected.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean sinning, but I mean, I have had the experience where I remember at one point, this was years and years and years ago, and now he's a friend. The songwriter and singer Michael Card was a huge influence on me as a kid. I mean, as a teenager, his music was really important to me. And I remember being at a conference where I was speaking and he was going to be doing music, and I dreaded it because I said to my wife, I've had this experience where people that I've read their work or benefited from them in some way, and then I meet them and I find out they're frauds, in some way or other. They don't really believe it.
Right.
I can't lose Michael Card in my life. It's been there at every stage. And thankfully, he's the real deal. And
right.
But the risk was there. And so I find, and that's especially true, I think, now, because I'm able to see some things up close that I previously would not have had. I just wouldn't have had any access to. And it's really, it's hard. It's hard to deal with. And again, not when you have somebody, I mean, we all know people who have sort of wrecked their lives. I'm accustomed to that. And I'm talking about when you see something where you realize, wait a minute, this is somebody who is just engaged in patterns of the most malignant sort of twisted personality, and everybody knows it, and everybody close in has known it for years and years and years. That's hard, and that sort of can send me into a kind of spiral of questioning what do I know, and what's a hall of mirrors around me. So that's an ongoingly difficult sort of thing. And I mean, a lot of the areas I have to work in, that's the case. And we've been working a lot over the last few years in areas of abuse within the church, and just seeing I mean, I've always known intellectually that that's there, that happens, dealt with that. But seeing the sorts of, not so much that happens, but the ways that people who should know better can cover that sort of thing up and even justify it behind closed doors in ways that they don't in public. That's hard. That's hard for me.
And that makes sense because of the four's need for, or I should say, fixation on authenticity.
Yeah.
Which can at times be more about originality and unique self-presentation. But it's also about, I think, the fours tend to have an ideal relationship with the past, an ideal view of the past.
Yes.
You were discussing that earlier, right? Touching the doorknobs and walking old neighborhoods and this, and the smell of the leaves on a fall morning. And this is what it was like riding my bike when I was 8 and this is on the street, blah, blah, blah. I do the same thing. So don't feel like you're the only four in the world who does that. But we also have a thing about people and the future, which is the sort of, we hold in the back of our mind unconsciously, I think, a platonic ideal. And so this person, Michael Card, this person blank, I had an idealized image of this person.
Right.
And I'm terrified to get near it to find out that they fall short of the platonic ideal, which in the vast majority of cases, nobody can live up to a four's ideal.
Right.
Nobody,
right.
And so I think this is why fours often fall into this kind of state of perpetual disappointment with people, places, and things, because they don't live up to the ideal. There's always going to be something missing that we believed was there. So I don't know. I guess we have to work on grace and forgiveness and our unrealistic expectations sometimes of our heroes, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's easier for me. That's easier for me than is the idea of sometimes I will see situations where it's not so much that the person is falling short of the ideal as much as the person is completely opposite of what the person appears to be or what the person says that he or she is about. And it's not so much that person drives me crazy as the system around it.
I see.
And you'll see this a lot in evangelical Christianity in America and in other areas too.
Yes.
Where this person, we have to sort of keep the illusion around this person or else we'll lose the ministry or the church or whatever,
or the books
label,
or the book sales or I've seen this tons of times myself. I've been in enough green rooms and relationships and places where I've been like, whoa, that was not what I expected, or that not as advertised, and that feeling has come up for me any number of times. So I'm curious to know if in your world as a four, and I bet everybody has, by the way, some stereotyped understanding of the Southern Baptist Convention, you know what I mean, or the Southern Baptist world. Have you ever felt like a mismatch or a misfit in that world?
All the time in every place. The good thing is it's not just this world. I'm a misfit and a mismatch in every world that I've ever been in. So I'm accustomed to it.
Okay, well, expand.
I think that, growing up, the issue was always that I was somebody who was really literary and sort of book oriented in a culture that was not. So that was always out of step. And then when I was I started out, I experienced this call to ministry really early on, but as I looked around at all of the ministers that I knew in my context and culture, I couldn't fit that. That just wasn't who I was. And so I assumed that must not be it. And so I had moved out into a political sort of life. But there, the issue, I started out as an intern in Washington and then moved my way up in working for a U.S. congressman, ended up being his communications director. I look back and think he was insane. I was 19.
You were 19?
19 at the time.
Wow.
But there, the issue was I was a Christian, an evangelical Christian. Now that wouldn't be. I'm dealing with congressional staff members by the thousands now who are committed evangelical Christians. But at the time, that was really rare, and so that was sort of out of step. So I've sort of been accustomed to that all along, and I had some models. The guy that I worked for, the United States congressman I worked for, number one was the real deal. I was dealing with a lot of other people who faced all this disappointment about their boss. And I was able to say, my guy is exactly the same behind closed doors as he is in public. And I was starting to see how unusual that was. But also, he was a total maverick. He was always bucking his party. He was always just doing what he thought was right. And it never bothered him. It bothers me, so I'm always trying to do what I think is right and acting according to conscience, but being wounded by the rejection that comes from that. So I can't really emulate his life because I don't think he ever cared at all. But I was accustomed to that.
You're actually there's a parallel between you and my life. I grew up a Roman Catholic until I was in high school, became involved in young life. My parents had stopped going to church, but I went to Catholic school until parochial school until like 4th or 5th grade. And, there's no such thing as an ex-Catholic. You know what I'm saying? I always tell people always tell me, oh, I'm an ex-Catholic. And I'm always like, well, no one's ever in my mind. Because once it's in the bone and in the blood, it's hard to get out, It's no lather, rinse, repeat on Catholicism in my mind.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the things I felt when I went into a more evangelical context, this is the 1970s, and it was a very different landscape in that day and age. I mean, it was so much more innocent and kinder, and it's infinitely different than what it is today.
Yeah.
I always felt, number one, because I'm a 4, and number 2, because I was raised Catholic, like a stranger in the promised land of evangelicalism. I was an English major. I was a musician. And we could have a long conversation one night at Andrews about this. I've had it with him once, and it was fantastic. That the Protestant imagination is a lot different than the Catholic imagination. And I realized one day that the reason I felt so out of step in the evangelical world wasn't because of theological differences or just because of my social awkwardness, which there was some of as a 4. It was because we had different imaginations.
Yes.
The Catholic imagination, well, the Protestant imagination tends to be sees the world as a place that is absent God's presence, that periodically God shows up and does some really cool things like raise from the dead or put the Bible together or whatever. And then he takes off again, and we live in this fallen world. So there's this fixation on fallenness and sin and brokenness. Whereas the Christian imagination, or the Catholic imagination, or we might call it a sacramental imagination, sees the world as brimming with God's presence, that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves. Thank you, St. Augustine. I mean, it's a whole different way of seeing the world. And so I'm often telling young fours in the church that the reason that they may be feeling so estranged and alienated isn't because there's something wrong with them. It's because they're in the middle of a clash of imaginations.
Mm-hmm.
And so I eventually just migrated away from an evangelical Protestant world toward the Episcopal Church. I mean, which was as close as I could get to a Catholic worldview, particularly in its high expression. And I see so many fours. I cannot tell you how many fours on a Sunday morning who came from Church of Christ, or they came from the Southern Baptist Church. They came coming over toward the Episcopal Church. Many of them are artists and writers, and it's like they come in and they're like, oh my gosh, this is a different world, you know? And so I think we see a lot of fours coming in the door of my Episcopal church, doing a migration of some kind. Have you observed that pattern yourself?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that happened with me, one half of my family is evangelical on my father's side. The other half is Roman Catholic on my mother's side. And so I grew up with both around me all the time, which I think prevented me, and this is no slam at Catholicism, as all my Catholic friends will know, because we've talked about it a lot. It prevented me from idealizing Catholicism in a way that I might have done if all I had seen was Bible Belt evangelicalism and have said, well, that means if I cross the Tiber, I'm going to be seated in church with a bunch of Walker Percys and Flannery O'Connors,
right, and Thomas Mertons.
Yeah, Thomas Mertons, yeah, and so I was able to sort of see. I also wasn't able to demonize it because I saw such genuine love and service among Catholic neighbors, Catholic relatives, often in ways I didn't among the evangelicals. But I couldn't idealize it either. And so I think those two things were sort of held in tension in my life in a way that probably kept that from right. being the direction the life took.
Well, yeah, it's there you go, being both and again. And I think, but I think this is such a rich conversation, and I hope it's not too erudite for people to maintain their interest. But I think, like, one of the things I just realized is I think fours by nature, and maybe this is part of the misfit thing, I'm going to write about this, I think, this just came to me, is I think by nature have much more sacramental imaginations than other types.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Who I think have more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not dialogical, but anyway, it'll come to me. Imaginations, you know?
Yeah.
Either or imaginations who become anxious when new ideas are introduced into a conversation. They become uneasy when institutions or institutional ideas or rules or protocols and things like that become shaky, right? Whereas fours are like, well, let's engage with the mystery of this thing.
Yeah.
And find out where God is in the middle of it. And I can see now I can see why you're probably very effective at what you do. But I would also imagine you experience real moments of loneliness and feeling, as most fours do, misunderstood.
Yes.
A lot of the time.
Constantly, yes.
Tell me about that before we close up. Tell me about what it's like, what the feeling, because I experienced that in evangelicalism as a young man constantly. And people honestly didn't understand me because I was reading Flannery O'Connor and I did have a Catholic mind that I didn't know was there. They didn't have an interest in reading the kinds of books I did. They didn't want to listen to the kind of music I wanted to. You get where I'm going. Like, yeah. So what, and that feeling of being misunderstood was so painful. It pierced me because I wanted to belong.
Right. And
I kept trying to fit the mold, but it just was too awkward and hard for me as a four, and inauthentic too. So
yeah.
What's it like for you to feel misunderstood?
Well, I mean, I think people, I hear people say about me all the time, he's just able to shake everything off. And I forget how people would word it, but think that it's not true at all. That's all just a facade and a persona. And largely because what I'm often trying to do is to make sure that, because a lot of the things that I'm dealing with do view vulnerability as weaknesses to exploit. I mean, I even had someone say to me one time, who was doing all sorts of things, who said, "We know that we can't take you down because all our wives and kids are with you. This is just psychological warfare," which I just thought, how is this remotely Christian? How do you say that? And still, but nonetheless, it really was. And so what I have to do is to kind of take myself out of the arena of that kind of psychological warfare, which means I'm better off if I don't know that sort of thing. So I'll have a lot of people, especially the 8s in my life, who kind of love conflict, and they like conflict as something to watch, who will love to sort of call me and say, "Can you believe what so-and-so said about you? Or did you?" And well, no, I haven't seen it and I don't want to. I like being ignorant of that so that I don't obsess over it, and so that it doesn't change the way that I see that person later on. If I have to deal with that person, it's just better for me not to know about it. And I think it's taken a long time, but we've worked out ways where that really is the case. I'm blissfully ignorant of a lot of things that I would never have been before, and that's helpful.
Well, I got to close out, though I don't want to, and we got to go hang. We got to do another port. We got to sit on the porch more and talk. I remember. Let me ask you this, because it's setting me up for something actually. For transparency's sake, what's the one book everyone in your life should read?
The book that's had the most influence on me of anything is Brothers Karamazov. And what I've noticed is when I read that, I've read it several times and at different stages of my life, and how differently it works itself and I'll even find with several books, I'll start all over again. I won't read a copy that I've read before. Start with a brand new copy and then sort of compare where I've made highlights and notes and where it's the same and where it's different. And that usually will tell me a lot about what's going on in my life.
That's amazing. And I have read the Brothers Karamazov many times in different translations.
Yeah.
And it too had a phenomenal impact on my life.
I'm having a lot of I've been doing this thing while we're all in quarantine for COVID called Reading in Exile, where I just sort of take a book off the shelf and tell people why they should read it, of various sorts. And when it came to Brothers Karamazov, I said, "Hey, you're going to be intimidated by this book. You shouldn't be." And I said, read multiple translations and it'll help you to understand it and whatever. And someone put up on Instagram, so Russell Moore tells us not to be intimidated by this 600-page book by reading it twice. Say, well, no, that's not really what I meant. But
oops, that's what I said, but not what I meant.
That's what I said, yeah. Literalist.
Well, one book that I'm sure you've read and that I pass around to people, and I say that you've probably read it because going back to the beginning of our interview, it immediately came to mind, which is Francis Spufford's book, Unapologetic. Have you read that book?
I have not, and a lot of people have recommended that book to me, so I should.
I think so, because what you said at the beginning was that what drew you back to faith was probably Lewis's lyricism, the heart of Lewis, right? His talks about Sehnsucht, in that longing, right, for the unnameable. That's where Spufford is coming at this in this book. The book is, I think the subtitle is Why Christianity Makes Emotional Sense.
Yes.
And I think every four should probably read a book that does a defense of the Christian faith on the basis of emotions. Yeah. Because, as you know, feelings are a way of thinking.
Right.
They're just a different way of thinking.
Right.
And seeing the world. Wow. Well, enough of this, because I'm getting so deep into the caverns of ideas with you that I'm afraid I'll never get out, and you'll never have the rest of your day to yourself. Anthony Skinner, what do you think?
I did just, through the process of this interview, read that article that you mentioned of Russell's, and it is really, really good. Everybody should read that.
Give the title again.
God doesn't want us to sacrifice the old. Christianity teaches that every single human life is valuable, even during the pandemic. Love it. So good.
Yeah, it's a very good article. Russell, thank you so much for being on.
Well, thanks for having me. I love this program and love listening to it. And so it's an honor to be on it. All
right. Well, listen, typology friends, listen up. Just a few things. One is I want to remind you that we have a test. In fact, Russell took it called the IEQ-9. It is, in my mind, a wonderful Enneagram assessment tool that gives you a really great and robust report about your specific type, right? Identifies your subtype, does a bunch of really good things. And also Enneagram Made Simple. All of these you can find on my website, iancron.com. Russell, how do they find out about you?
They can just go to russellmoore.com.
Great. Glad you got that URL. Anthony, you know how we always end the show, right?
Yes. You want to take us out?
Oscar Wilde.
For yourself, and everybody else is already taken.
See you next time, folks.